Now the shutter blades I can clean with metal polish, and I'm using a hard foam plastic block to do this. It's stiff enough to support the blades, soft enough that I'm not likely to get in any trouble with it. So I'm much the same procedure. I'm holding the blade down with one cotton bud, polishing it with the other. Make sure I get both sides of the blades polished. And I'll just work my way through, get the whole 5 blades done, and I'll show you the result. Oh, in fact, I'll finish one blade entirely, and then I'll show you the comparison. So here we have 2 blades. One I've cleaned and polished, and one that's in the original state. You can see it's quite an improvement. That surface is good now, it's not showing any signs of corrosion. Here's one of the original ones, corrosion and oil staining. Well, the mechanism plate needs to come apart. So we've got 3 screws hold the lens tube to the mechanism plate, and the blade actuating ring is trapped between the lens tube and the mechanism plate. So I'll just remove those 3 screws. The longer of the 3 screws holds this plate in place, and that plate holds the tail on the main drive spring. So there's our 3 main components of the mechanism plate, and this all needs to be cleaned with some naphtha on a cotton bud to remove all the oil, any dust, old grease, anything that shouldn't be there really, so that these 3 components start off nice and clean, and then will be lubricated by me as I see fit. Right, that was the lens tube. Now let me clean the other 2 components, and I'll put them back together. Well, here's my mechanism plate. Nice and clean and ready to go. Now, you can lubricate the blade actuating ring. I choose one of a couple of ways. Quite commonly I would use graphite powder. Sometimes I use molybdenum paste. And I'll just wipe a very thin smear on both surfaces. And if it looks like I'm not putting much on there, it's because I'm not putting much on there. You only need enough to leave a dirty mark and it'll do the job nicely. So I'll get this in place. So I've got to hook it under that spring. Pull that round there like that, and get this spring. This is the detent spring. I'll get this hooked into position behind that post, and the lens tube only goes on in one position, just making sure none of the levers are trapped underneath it. That all looks good. This bracket goes on in this position next to the post here, and the longer of the 3 screws goes through there. If you mix the screws up, it's not going to go well for you. It means that if you end up with a short screw in this position, it won't be biting much of the mechanism plate. If it's not biting much of the mechanism plate, when you apply the normal torque to the screw, chances are you'll strip the thing right out. And if you put the long screw through one of the other 2 positions, it would stick up through the mechanism plate at one of these points, and then it would catch on one of the blades, and it would stop the shutter from working correctly. So they're all in place, so I can do those 3 screws up. Check that the blade actuating ring moves smoothly, and it does. Certainly moves more smoothly than it did when I started. And if I put that in the blade's open position, which is that way, I can fit my shutter blades. If I bring them over here, and they do have a definite start position, and it's here. And unlike diaphragm blades, shutter blades are just lay one on top of another. They are not interleaved. So there is a first position and a last position. The diaphragm blades, all blades are equal. That's my shutter blades in position, and with them in position I can put the shutter case on here, and it only goes on in one position, and it's going on here. The shutter case is held together with 3 screws. I'll run them in lightly and check that the blades are sitting correctly, that nothing was knocked out of alignment when I lifted the case over it. You don't want a shutter blade crushed out of position somewhere, it'll end up getting damaged. There we go, the shutter blade's open and closed nicely. Those 3 screws can be tightened up. And the shutter blades are looking much better than they did when we started. Right, so some molybdenum paste. There's a couple of spots that I need to attend to. One is on that detent spring where it runs over that post. I'll just run a little bit of molybdenum paste on there. And on the blade actuating ring there are 2 pins, one here and one over here, where the main drive cam picks up that blade actuating ring and shifts it. So that has to be correctly lubricated. Now I can start putting the springs and various bits and pieces back on that mechanism plate. And I think my favourite tweezers here have become magnetised because they're giving me grief. This goes over that post, and I'll hold a toothpick over the centre of that so that spring cannot get away, and lift the tail of that spring up and over. No, not like that. Pick the tail of the spring up, lift it over the top of all the other obstacles and hook it behind that pin there, which I've just achieved. That's good. Next spring is the return spring for the B lever. That goes on here. There's a groove in this post that the spring runs around. I'll swing that back out there, and the B lever can go on. So I'll hold this lever back out of the way, move the blade actuating ring forward so the blades are fully open, and the B lever I'll pull back against its spring, get it over its post, and allow it to sit there. Oh, the spring's just fallen down there. I'll have another go at that. I don't want that spring getting trapped underneath because it's very difficult to fish it back out. Well, it's keen. Don't know what's giving me so much grief today. Must be the cold weather. That's better. So the spring is sitting in its little notch and shouldn't get away. Now this spring is on the screw that holds that all in place. So holding the screw by the spring, I've got to get that screw started. Check that that moves, it does. Tighten that screw up and swing that screw up, that spring over, lift it and swing it right back around so it's like against the lens tube over here. The B lever's return spring works fine. I can pull those blades back into the rest position. That's all good. Now here's the pallet wheel, we'll drop that into place. And the small sector gear that drives the pallet wheel is here, and I'm just going to lubricate the tip of that arm with a bit of molybdenum paste so that it latches and unlatches smoothly. That's good, and that's held under tension with this spring, which needs to be hooked into position. So hook it over the post there, stretch it out into the hole, and there it is. So that's latched in position. When the shutter's cocked, it's cocked there. As soon as the shutter starts to move, it releases this sector gear which drives this wheel, which is the pallet wheel, and that gives us our delay before the shutter is actually starting to move. Okay, so there's a little detent spring here. I'll just put a little touch of molybdenum paste on there, and the setting lever for our self timer and flash sync is here. There's some small ratchet teeth here where it couples to that release over here. So I just put a smear of molybdenum paste on there and drop this into position so that the pin sits over here and its spring is on this side. That's fine. Now here's the shim, and here's the setting lever for the aperture settings. And that's held in place with 3 small screws with quite broad heads on them, thin broad heads. Get them in position. If this lever is distorted, which can happen if people have been heaving and tugging on it, then this might not move as smoothly as it should. So I'm just checking as I get each of the 3 screws in place that I'm not creating a tight spot of some sort. And if I am, I want to know where it is. Oh, that's good. That action is very smooth, no resistance at all to speak of, so that's good. The rest of our flash sync mechanism I can get in place. This little sprung-loaded beastie sits in there. Our flash contact sits on top of it, and if I cock this, it allows my flash contact to move in slightly so that I can get this top plate with the catch in position. And I'll find the 2 screws for that. That's one of them. There's its return spring. Oh, that tweezers are going to give me grief. I'm going to have to demagnetise them. And there should be a screw there. Good. Got all those pieces. Right, so the plain screw goes at this end. The return spring sits here, and the screw that goes through it has got a shoulder on it that the spring is free to rotate around. And if the spring is not sitting correctly, it will be trapped underneath the shoulder instead of being able to rotate around it. Now that's correct now. So I've got to lift that spring up behind this arm. There's a notch in the back of this arm that spring drops into. And making sure that spring's sitting correctly around that screw head there. No, it's not quite sitting where it should. That's better. And that's the return spring for this latch. Now here we have the shutter release lever, which sits in here, has to catch underneath the B lever at this point. You see all this? And this spring has to be tucked in down the side of the case, like that. Let's make sure that's tucked in. Yeah, that's good. So that's our release lever. So as you press on the release lever, it swings this up, swings this back. That allows the main drive cam to release and fire the shutter. Alright, so I'll just wipe some molybdenum paste through the centre of my main drive cam. And there's a couple of surfaces there I want to take particular attention to. This curved surface here, that's where it runs against the tip of the retard gear. This arm and this arm are where it couples to the blade actuating ring. So I'll pop that on there, bring that round to the rest position. And I have the main drive spring here, and that is in exceptionally good condition. If we take the top of the spring here, it being at 12 o'clock, this tab here is sitting up at about 2 o'clock. Now that's basically how a spring looks when it's new. Now very rarely do they look like that, because typically they are somewhat more relaxed, having had decades sitting somewhere on the bloody shelf, cocked under tension, and so losing their enthusiasm. And I've got to see if I can get the tail of the spring right round to there. And this one being in exceptionally good order is probably not going to want to go. There we go, it's in. So if I cock the shutter, yeah, it works. I was a bit surprised to see B work there, because B typically doesn't work when there's no speed train in there, because the B lever usually doesn't have a chance to drop in quick enough to work. But it dropped in there. That's alright. I'm not going to complain about that. Normally the mechanism's on its way back by the time the B lever drops. Okay, so that looks good. Next thing are the retard gear train and the delay timer. And they've been cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'll lubricate these speed trains with a bit of graphite powder. It seems fine. I don't typically lubricate these speed trains with watch oil or any other magic potion. Particularly the retard gear train, some of those wheels are moving at a very high speed. Much more so than wheels moving watches. I'm not convinced that it's a helpful thing. Right, just blown the excess powder, graphite powder out of there. Let's cock this shutter and put the retard gear train in position and see if we get good action. Find the 3 screws I'm looking for. That's one of them. This is the one I want. And this screw goes through an oversized hole in that retard gear train, which allows you some adjustment. You can shift the retard gear train in or out slightly for greater or lesser engagement with the main cam. Greater engagement giving you a slower speed, lesser engagement giving you a higher speed. Let's see what we get here. That's running nice and smoothly. I would have said that was somewhat faster than a second. So we need more engagement than that. 1 second being the default when nothing, when no speed has been selected. That's more like it. I'll use that as my starting position. Check I've got that screw tight. And the delay action or self timer can likewise go into the shutter. And a single screw holds that in position. Well, that seemed to run smoothly enough. That should be fine. Okay, a little bit more work and I can test those shutter speeds and we'll be good to go. So I'll just wipe a few components here. The shutter speed settings cam plate, and really here I'm just removing old oil and grease, and of course along with it any rubbish that it's managed to pick up in the way of dust and dirt. This ring, which I sort of think of as the internal cocking ring that cocks the shutter, cocks the main drive of the shutter. Let's get that all clean, and then the pinion that takes the action from that internal cocking ring to the main drive cam and spring. So that drops into place there. The internal cocking ring, I like to wipe the inside surface with molybdenum paste, the outside edge with molybdenum paste, and leave it at that. It doesn't need much. This hooks over this post here, the end of that spring. Bring this round, that engages, just checking that's hooked behind that tab on the self timer, that the last tooth is engaged there. That all looks complete. And the speed settings cam plate, well, this piece here, sets the speeds on the the retard gear tray. I usually wipe some molybdenum paste around there, around the centre here and around there, and that's enough. There's not much to speak of there and there's not much to see. That's all that's required. So around at this position should be an 1/8 of a second. Let's see what we get. That sounds credible. I'll put the front retainer ring on here and I'll test that with my shutter speed tester and see what that shutter runs like. That really doesn't want to run on there. Was it tight getting it off? I can't remember now. Yeah, that is reluctant to start. It's a bit lumpy. Yeah, it's okay there. That thread must be subtly damaged. Right, well, I'll test it and see how we go. What's the 15th sound like? I think it might be slightly slow.